I am now putting on my Ray's software hat. So not just a speaker in the Delphi world, but a vendor. Because that's really way back in 1995, a week before the launch of Delphi 1, I started Ray Software as a consulting company to help other people getting involved in this brand new tool to make their lives easier, become better developers and all of that. Welcome, come on in. And switching from consulting to products, because that's really where a great way to get a lot of people some help. CodeSite was an extension of some work I did for the component writing book that I did back in the first versions of Delphi, and that led to Ray's components. And then when components don't work right, back in Delphi 1, Delphi disappears, just goes away. And so we needed like an extra debugging tool, something that made it easier to track down problems. And that was the birth of CodeSite. So really what I want to talk to is from not going all the way back there, but that's where the root of all of this is just building things in Delphi and being able to capture information about what's going on in our program so we can locate problems faster. And if we can do that, then we can get back to implementing things that are important for our application. So, and I'll touch on some of our other products at the end of this session, but really this is all about CodeSite and where we are today and where we'll be going very soon, because you're the first group to actually see a CodeSite 6 preview. So the first, no one has seen this stuff yet. So it's still being baked and cooked. That's why I'm sitting down at the booth and my head's down. That's where it's close. We're getting close. It's just getting all the little details down. So it's very exciting. A lot of cool things. So this is just an overall. I don't have a ton of slides. I have a few just to help me keep track of, make sure I'm hitting the high points. But we're going to get into some code and see how things, and put it all together. But first, to start, how many of you have used CodeSite? Handful, great. So several if you haven't, that's right. That's part of what this session's also about, is show you what CodeSite can do for you. So really, as I kind of touched on this before, CodeSite is an application logging system, first and foremost. It started out kind of just as a debugging tool, but it grew from that, taking user feedback. As the first version we took back, I got feedback like, oh, it'd be great if it did this. Oh yeah, that's a great idea, let me put that in. And we would just kind of do this over and over again. Again, the key piece is help you find problems faster and then also be able to monitor to see what your app is doing. Is it performing correctly? If you have bottlenecks, if you have areas of code that are getting hit a lot more than you expected, and maybe the flow isn't right. That's a great way. Sometimes problems aren't just obvious. They're, oh, you're going down an extra route, extra nested calls that you didn't think you were making. Seeing that history is really important. Kind of going back to some old days of how I used to do this demo. How many people use show message to do debugging? Right? We've all done it. Why do we do that? Well, it's easy, for one, but we all know we really should be doing something different. And the reason why we do that a lot of times is we've put breakpoints in our code, and you've all done this, and you get to the breakpoint, and the error happens or whatever, you get there, and then you try to inspect variables that are around, and they're not there anymore, because our optimizing compiler has pulled it off of the stack, so it's got no data, so, oh, got to throw a message box up. And which is fine as long as the focus change doesn't cause problems in your app. So don't put a message box in a paint routine. It's not a good thing. And we also lose the history. We know that we got the message that showed up, but how did we get there? And that's really where the foundation of any kind of logging goes, but specifically for CodeSite as well. So it is an instrumentation. We're going to add CodeSite message calls into our code in order to track and log things down. But it goes well beyond that because you can capture all kinds of data inside of CodeSite. So we provide a logger class, not just a log function. And we'll see a variety of different ways in which that gives us a lot of added information. So let me sit down and kind of just do a quick little overview of what CodeSite gives us today. And I'm going to just get back to my Windows desktop here. Where's Delphi? Delphi's up there. I want to pull up. We're going to get into that in a minute. That's CodeSite 6 stuff. And so if I'll pull this up, I have a little tool called the CodeSite Message Generator. This is the version 5 version of the editor there. And so typically this is showing you the kind of statements that you would make. So there's a very basic send message, sends a string, you can get the data, but you can do more than that. We can send over any data type that you want. So strings, integers, rectangles, remember I'm a component writer, anything dealing with components I've got natively supported over here. But so if I go ahead and click send, this live viewer comes up and gives me a list of what I've clicked on. And so obvious things are there. We don't have to do any string conversions like you typically do with a logging system. And we also have this idea of categories, which comes really valuable a little bit later. So I have different message types and message contents. That's what the two icons tell me. And I can natively send over data, even dates, times, and so forth. We can get to some more advanced data types, like have you ever wanted to see a list that you're populated, either like a query or just a list of items you're reading from a file? It'd be nice to be able to just say, hey, send me and log the contents of that list. Well, that's what this song titles is doing. It's making sure that I've populated my song titles right, and I click on it, and the inspector pane over here shows me all the contents of the list. I don't have to do anything. I don't have to iterate through it. It just does it for us automatically. Same thing with system fonts. You want to look at color values. Those show up in there. Not that that's really unique because it's not really a fancy color. File contents, even memory dumps, we got you covered. Here's one of my favorites because we deal with objects all the time. And I'm sending over the main form. I make a change to it. I send it back out. And I'm sending over some other data objects. I go and send that. I click on the form. And you get an inspector grid of all of the published properties that are in that object. At that time, it's a timestamp. It's a log of what that form looks like at that point in time. You know, a few milliseconds later, 5 to be exact, or well, yeah, 5, that it's changed. Well, what's changed between those two states? Well, just select the two of them, and it will show you the difference between the two objects. So being able to analyze what we've captured and drill down makes the whole combination of things quite powerful. So any types of data point, here's a collection. So the status pane is status panel has a bunch of panes in it, and we see each one, and you get the properties of it below it. And all you had to do is just do send and send the panel over. So it knows how to deal with collections. It knows how to deal with generic lists. It knows how to deal with bitmaps. So that's my next tab here. So if you wanted to get a screenshot or an image that you're working with, I mentioned the screenshots. There's a send screenshot method. We'll go ahead and here, there's the screenshot. You can scale it, size it appropriately. Of course, everything's, you make that bigger and so forth. Every message has a number of values that are tied to it. They're showing up in the message pane down at the bottom here. You can also view the columns. So if I showed all of the columns, they show up. So we know what app it was generated from, which computer, the process ID, thread ID. So because you can have multiple threads, and you want to see the interactions that all happened for that. And of course, the date and time at which that was recorded. Some Windows-specific things, registry info. There's the idea of a checkpoint. So if you're doing something iterative, this is great for loops that fail. You get the index out of range error. Like, okay, well, what happened? What am I working on when those things happen? Add a checkpoint, run the code, and it writes out the checkpoints every time it fires. It auto-increments itself, so you don't have to keep track of it. So it's very helpful to figure out, oh, what is the 9th item that I'm working with? Let me go track that down. Database support, so if you want to log like a record from a database table, client data set, mem table, go ahead and do that. You can even do the whole database table. And so we will take a snapshot of that and put that into the grid. I would not do that with a 1,000,000 record table, of course. Wouldn't be that fun. XML data, some things like that. There's custom data, because a lot of times we might have custom information that we want that may or may not have published properties. So we're using RTTI to capture a lot of that for you automatically. Well, if you're building a custom record, maybe you want to be able to log that in a special way. We give you the facilities to do that. This is where I was touching upon the idea of a category. Most logging systems, and actually I don't know of any other ones than CodeSite does this, is you have log levels. Typically it's like 4. You might have 1, 2, 3, 4. It's, it's a critical, it's, verbose. You might have it's very low, and they're all in a stack. And level 1 is always going to show up. And if you're interested, you might get level 2, you might get level 3. You can set what log level you want to be interested in. Well, that's fine, except log messages have different values associated with them. I may be interested in seeing this, but I also want to be able to group log messages together, and inside of that might have its own priority levels and things like that. So that's where this idea of a category comes from. And if I go, I'm going to clean up the display just a little bit, and then just bring back the categories and the time to make my point here, is I've got a few different things working around. I've got a custom logger, so instead of log levels that get passed into the functions, you use a separate logger. And a logger is just an object. And there's a general global one that everybody gets called CodeSite. So codesite.send is there for free, but you can create other logger instances and give it a category and a category name and even colors. So if I go and click these in my little calculator, and we can see that there's a calculator category, and it's colored a little purplish color, and I can see, everything that's going with that is associated with it. Here's the sample code, and I didn't know you could drag and drop in there. That was kind of a little funky. And so inside of here, this is also showing structure to our messages. So you have this enter and exit method that we can call to further group your data and be able to see who's calling what. It's great for those, infinite loops or those, recursive routines, and you want to see, does it unwind properly? Because if it just keeps going enter and enter and enter, then you'll find that. In this example, I'm just showing the structure, and when I hit equal, then I have an expression logger for that. Well, what's interesting is I can disable the entire logger. So maybe I'm only interested in seeing the expression messages. So I go back, I've cleared it out, I type in a new one, there's no new messages coming into the view, and I keep that in view. Now when I go and hit equal on this new version, I get that expression. So this is really powerful for controlling how much logging information you want. And this can be done dynamic. This isn't a compiler change or a setting. It is, you can just provide some way to change that value. I'm doing it on the UI here, but you can certainly do it in a any file setting, a registry entry, database setting, whatever way you want to control settings, you can control how much information gets logged. Now, one other area that's rather unique to CodeSite as well is this idea of the scratch pad. And so I've been saying we send CodeSite messages because literally we are sending them from your application code, the log, where the app is running, to a dispatcher, which is a process running in the background. There's an icon if it's surfaced in the system tray. But that dispatcher takes all the CodeSite messages that all your loggers send to it, packages them up, and then sends them someplace else. So it's just a dispatcher. The default for the developer is to just send them to the live viewer, which is what I've been working with right here. We obviously can send these to a log file because we're going to want these persistent, especially when we start talking about deployment and putting this into a production system. You're not going to want to have this live display sitting somewhere. We want to have the log files created. But leveraging that live dynamic nature of sending the messages, we can actually use that to capture data immediately. So it's like transient data that we don't really want to fill our log file with, but we want to know about it. The best example I like to show is oh, my scratch pad is visible there. Let me open that up a little bit more. This is this area down at the bottom, and mouse moves are great. Example, I want to know where my mouse is. Am I calculating the coordinates correctly because of the parent-child relationships and so forth? As I move that mouse over, I'm updating the entry in the scratch pad. I don't want to fill my log with that data, but I am interested in it. So this is what writing to the scratch pad does. And it just dynamically builds up as it gets new entries. And then it flashes whenever it gets updated. If you clear out the list, it'll just recreate them in whatever way it needs to, and it knows based on that list. So that's another really powerful feature that people like. I mentioned sending it to the live viewer is one. We can also send it to a log file. There are several different ways about destinations that we can send things to. It's actually one of the biggest changes coming in CodeSite 6, so I'm not going to go into a lot of detail. I'm going to do it when we get to the CodeSite 6 stuff to explain the changes, but that is the quick overview of what CodeSite gives you. Any questions about any of this?
It's possible to have multiple destinations.
Yes.
So having something like special live view and then the log file.
Correct. And that happens today, even with CodeSite 5. So these are the different combinations. Well, this isn't it. These are just settings I have pre-built. But yes, here's one where it's viewer and log file simultaneously. In CodeSite 5, the options that we have are the live viewer, which is your default. You can go to a log file. You can send it to basically using TCP, that's one of the destination types, or UDP. So it's really kind of how we're sending it. It's kind of weird. I'm with you. It's why it's being changed. And so it's a network connection. It's sending it to a remote machine. Well, the dispatcher runs on that other machine. So dispatcher knows how to send messages to another dispatcher. So we can send it from our application, goes to the local dispatcher, which then says goes to the remote dispatcher. Then the remote dispatcher, along with the payload, says, oh, what do you want to do with this message? Well, I want to put it on a live viewer on the remote machine, or I want to put it onto a log file on the remote machine. And then there is even an old ISAPI DLL dispatcher and a CGI dispatcher. No one uses them. They're going away. The intent, though, was that you could actually write a URL host. Your local dispatcher would then send it up to the ISAPI DLL or the CGI script, and it would then do something with that on that remote machine. It's interesting in theory, but no one ever wanted to use it. But the network stuff was really useful to basically take logging information and put it somewhere else. So we're going to leverage all of that. Okay, so perfect segue. I didn't even know that was going to section out like that. Worked out great. So new destinations. I talked about, okay, yeah, you can do remote in CodeSite 5 and earlier, but it's cumbersome the way it was set up. It was more protocol-based than anything else. But we've changed a bunch of things. One, kind of substantial, although not really. The live viewer, file viewer concept was okay to start, but it still confused people. And so we've changed the live viewer is really just called the CodeSite console now, which more accurately describes what it does. It's your developer console. It's getting all the incoming messages. You get one of those on your machine. It's a singleton. It knows that, oh, I'm the console. So anything that's being captured is going to be showing up there. So that is now the new default instead of the viewer. And so same idea, same principle. Log file, same concept there. We obviously want to create log files. Do I say more of this? I'll say more of this. I'll say it now. The log file format, though, is different. We've optimized it. We've made it more efficient. We've gotten rid of some extra baggage. That actually comes from the fact that the CodeSite messages that we send across, we've gotten rid of some of the extra things that we didn't need anymore. One being, how do we route these messages? Because the message itself in CodeSite 5 and earlier doesn't have all the information it needs. It has an identifier in it that tells where it's going to go, but that means that the dispatcher has to know if I get a message with this identifier in it, what do I do with it? So there's setup that needs to be involved. There's extra messages that get sent behind the scenes. None of you guys ever saw that, but it was a headache for me. And because when it didn't work very well. And so we got rid of all of that. So every message is completely self-contained. It knows where it needs to go and end up, that's actually really cool. So in addition to the log file, one of the issues that we've been dealing with, not an issue, request is a better way to phrase this, is how many of you in your organizations use an aggregate logger for other apps and systems like Splunk? There's some other tools that are like that. It's really big in the US and it's really big at Disney, which is the other company I work for. And so we're constantly trying to take all the system logs, Windows event logs, and application logs and ingest them into Splunk in order to do it. Well, with the CodeSite log file format, it's not just text, because we want to save space where we can and there's extra information in it, that Splunk doesn't know how to consume that easy enough. And so we're creating a new format called a digest, which is essentially an ingestible format for other tools to get that data if they want to do something else with it. That's where like Splunk is kind of cool because it's got all kinds of analytics and querying that are built in and notifications that is beyond what we would ever want to add into CodeSite. But we can certainly capture all the logging data that you have in your app like we do today and just put it into a format that is automatically ingestible by other tools. So this is huge for enterprises. So that's coming. There's no more TCP or UDP as the destination type. That was just how. It's now called network. But it goes on beyond that. So you specify a host and a port of where you're going to send it to. You're still sending it to a remote dispatcher to receive it. But instead of having to specify whatever's there, because that makes the packet much longer of like, oh, I want it to be a console, I want it to be this log file. Well, you don't know where the log file is going to go on that remote machine. You shouldn't worry about that. So there's an associated profile with the network destination. So you give it a profile name. The profile is defined on that remote machine in the dispatcher that's running there. And I'll show an example of that in just a little bit. But that's really powerful to manage where the log files are going. And if you want to move it to a new directory or even a new drive, well, you just change the profile. Your app doesn't have to change. That wasn't always the case. And that was a friction point people had, having flexibility. There's also a web destination type. This is basically getting rid of the old ISAPI stuff and the CGI thing and replacing it with a REST dispatcher. So a REST-based dispatcher, it's more or less provided as a proof of concept of where you could do that for yourself. So we show you how to build, because again, are you really going to want to use our really low-level, lightweight REST server to do that? Probably not. You probably want to build your own, but be able to take those messages and route them and have extra checks and things that you would want. So we give you a way to basically extend the web destination. So as long as your REST server defines an endpoint, which we tell you what that is, to take an incoming message, you can then forward it to whoever needs it. And it'll make much sense when I talk about the next step of why we're going with all that. And that is because the dispatcher is optional now in CodeSite 6. So in CodeSite 5 and earlier, the dispatcher was this key tool that takes all the incoming log messages from whatever applications that you have. And it's really useful and powerful if you have like two applications that are talking to each other or coordinating each other. You don't really want them in separate log files. You want to share, have that all unified so you can see the correlations between, oh, I generated this event here. Did it get responded over here? Yes, it did, and here's the payload that it's sending back and forth. So you need a shared dispatcher in order to do something like that, some extra concept. Now, there's some disadvantages of having a dispatcher external process like that. One, you have to deploy it if you're wanting to do production logging, which some companies are okay with, others not so much. They'd prefer not to. It's a challenge when you're doing things, you're building an app and you're only logging things about the app. You don't need to have this shared idea, and you just want to generate a log file. And you still have the concerns that my app's going to be multi-threaded. I don't want to have to worry about the threaded aspect of it and so forth. So that is where now you have the option of changing the dispatcher that's used by the destination. It's either private, which means it's your dispatcher for that application. So every application that uses CodeSite will now have its own internal dispatcher to be able to route messages. So in the dispatcher, the internal one or the private one is the one that actually writes out the files. It's in a background thread, so it's a lower priority. It's not affecting your app code any, which is great. But if you are in an environment where you have multiple apps and you want to leverage the shared one, you still can. So this is huge for a lot of developers who are writing service applications and things like that, because the old transport mechanism of how we would send messages from the loggers to the viewer or the dispatcher would get blocked by Windows services. So you had to kind of jump through hoops in order to get that to work, and it works. But that's all been resolved because we're now using TCP for all of our cross-process communication, which gives us some really added values moving forward. So let me show a little bit more of these things. And so I'm going to pull over the Hero app. Let me go over to Delphi here, and that's where this is from. And you might be wondering, well, what does Hero mean, and where does that come from? This tells you how long I've been working on CodeSite 6. Anybody see the movie Big Hero 6? It's the animated movie. So the young boy, and his name is Hiro, H-I-R-O. So CodeSite 6, Big Hero 6, that was my little connection there. This has been going on for a long time. It's just like it's so much of the product changed. It got to a point where I was like, okay, well, I'll just do this. And I was like, oh, well, that's not going to do it enough. I have literally gone through every line of code in the entire product and evaluated whether it still makes sense to keep it like it was or redesign it in a different way to give the flexibility that we wanted. Because the big one that's going to come next, you'll understand why. So for now, keeping the focus on these destinations. And so my little app here, let me go ahead and run this. And what we will see is, no, Windows, you're trying to be too helpful. So here is the example of what these look like. I'm going to use the private dispatcher. I don't need to have the external one. I've got two there. Let me close them both down. That is one thing to note, is that CodeSite 6 can run simultaneously with CodeSite 5. That's actually by design. There's enough changes in the communication and everything that we're doing that we're making a break. So you can have CodeSite 5, your apps will still run it, but if you have CodeSite 6 as well, anything that's CodeSite specific will go through the CodeSite 6 tool chain to do what you want. Now, you're reading CodeSite 5 log files with the new tools works just fine. It's just the live console communication that's all changed. So I've set up the console. There's my mouse. And I'm just sending over a test message. We get the new CodeSite console comes up. Nothing too dramatic here. One of the final things that we're working on actually connects to this little flyer here. And if you stop by the booth, you may have seen it, is we get a lot of requests like, oh, it'd be great if I could, CodeSite could run in dark style UI, because I've got Windows dark, and I've changed Delphi, that has dark UI. Now I pull up my CodeSite viewer and it is just bright white. And so I built new styles that we actually made into its own product. And that's 2 of those copies will be raffled off at the prize giveaway. So if you're interested in doing VCL styles, you have an opportunity to win it. If not, take advantage of our discount code and you can pick up the styles. We're going to be leveraging them for CodeSite's UI. Anyway, that's fine. That's nothing dramatic there. The digest, I'll go ahead and add that. And I'm putting in just a little setting here. We use DIG or digest for the extension. It has all the same part settings. I guess for those of you who've used it, you're probably aware of this. If you haven't, when you write to a log file, we give you, this is today, there's not new stuff, but today, you often want to control how big the log file gets. So you can specify a max size of the log file, and if it reaches the next size, then it will create a new part. And you can also specify a maximum number of parts. And if you set that to some number, then older log file parts get deleted as more and more messages grow. So it allows you to control how much logging information you're recording. If you don't have them set, it's just going to keep growing bigger and bigger and bigger. And they can get quite big. We've got at Disney, the stuff I work on, we've got a couple that are topping a gigabyte a day. There's a lot of logging data going on. It's a little too much, so we're kind of trimming that back a little bit. But this new format for the digest is, and this is the breakdown of the various pieces of setting this up. And I'll show a simple way. You wouldn't have to do this yourself. These are all sub-properties that we can change. And I'll show example in the code. But let me go ahead and set that up. I'm using the private one. I'm going to send that same message. It showed up there. But then if I go to my directory, in my logs directory, I should have, what did I call that? app.dig. There's my app.digest. It was just updated. And if I go ahead and take a look at that, then we can see that here's what I just added in, test message number 2. And so this is a pure text-based format that has the same information that we would get for CodeSite. It's just designed to be ingested by someone else. So that was a nice new feature there. I mentioned the network stuff. Actually, let me save the network thing for the next example because it'll have more of an impact because I actually do it. We're going to send something remotely and we'll see the impact. But the cool thing is notice there was no dispatcher that was started. I shut them down, and so everything is self-contained inside of the app. And it's still going to the live, the console here to see that information. All right. So I touched on this before. We leverage, old CodeSite would leverage from your logger classes to the dispatcher, the local one on your machine. It would use WM copy data. Unless you called a method to tell it to use TCP, which allowed it to go over the Windows service station, so services can't use WM copy data because they exist in a different space, so you had to do some other loop workaround. We get rid of it, so everything is TCP. So not just from the loggers to the shared dispatcher, like it was, if you use it, that's still there, but logger to console is now TCP. And it doesn't really matter where that dispatcher that you're talking to, whether it's the shared one running on that local machine or a remote one that's on another machine. And that's another big area because the other big feature is multi-platform support and multi-framework support. So CodeSite, obviously designed from the get-go, knows all about the VCL, knows all about Windows, even Win64, but and technically, you can still use CodeSite today in FMX apps. I use it all the time. My targets, though, are Windows-based. I can't target an FMX app for Mac OS or iOS or Android and use CodeSite in it. And it's even, when you do use it, even in a Windows app, you will get some compiler warnings because duplicate resources come in because you're actually bringing stuff in that's VCL specific because that's what CodeSite's made for. It was for the VCL. So a lot of work went into making CodeSite fully cross-platform. So anything, most of it is, if you think about it, we're capturing data in objects, an object, RTTI is RTTI, it doesn't really matter. However, there were a lot of things like, normally you wouldn't think about it, like sending that screenshot or sending an image. Well, that image implies a VCL image component and the VCL T bitmap in order to display that image. Well, that's VCL specific. Doesn't exist in FMX. There's an image over on FMX, but not the same one. Then then you start talking about like more of that type of stuff, like, oh, sending the list of components or controls. Well, components is okay because components are over on FMX, but controls, there's a control that's Windows-based, there's controls that are FMX-based. So every piece is that. So anything that is common now stays inside of CodeSite logging. That's the main unit that you will always add into your code when you want to do CodeSite logging. So it's CodeSite logging, and then you get a CodeSite logger to work with. Lot of classes and things to help support it, but now we also offer, there's a CodeSite logging.vcl, a CodeSite logging.fmx, a CodeSite logging.db. So we are leveraging what I'm calling these CodeSite assistants. They're new static classes that help us pack platform or framework specific features and concepts in order to be included in with the regular CodeSite logging capabilities. So it's a way of extending it without having to go through a lot of hoops or write a lot of custom things. What's really cool about it is that you can leverage the same technique for your custom data. If you've ever tried to send custom data in CodeSite now, you can do it. It's quite powerful, but it's a little cumbersome, I'll be totally honest. We reworked that to use the same technique we're doing for the others. But cross-platform, let's see what we got. We have Hero FMX. So let me go back to Delphi. I'm going to close off Hero here, and I'm going to switch over to Hero FMX. And here's the app. It's not a very fancy app. Doesn't need to be. But it's going to do something. It's an FMX app, so that's first thing to note. So let me go into here, and I'm creating a new destination. I know I'm running on the Mac or whatever, but I'm assigning it to the Documents folder for that operating system. So we have symbolic names, so yes, because this is a Mac, I know where it's going to go. iOS does the same thing. I am just focused on this, so I want to create a new cross-platform CodeSite log file. Great. And then I'm assigning it to my logger so that when I click my button 1, I should see these things show up. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and run this, and assuming everything stays connected, I've been doing it downstairs all morning, so it's going to launch that application over on the Mac. So it is a true Mac ARM. I have an M2 Mac here, so it's the ARM processor, Delphi code FMX, and the reason I have my Documents folder here is because we're going to see if a new file gets created here when I click that button. And sure enough, there's my CodeSite cross-platform log file. All cross-platform, that's Mac, that's all in there, so great. We can now have CodeSite information on our cross-platform apps. But let's go a little bit further. So let me shut this down, go back to my app. And over here, I'm going to turn this to be true. This is how you would set up your destination. So you create a CodeSite destination. It's no longer a component, so you don't need the owner anymore for those of you who've done this. And so now we set this up, and I'm setting, you can set up multiple destinations and then activate them as needed. So I am setting this network host to be my Windows PC on my machine. They're bridged networks. So my host is one IP, my network, my Windows machine is the other, and I'm setting a profile. And the profile is over, and this is where I do need to get my dispatcher running. And let me go and grab that. Close this down real quick. CodeSite, Studio, bin. Dispatcher. So dispatcher changes a little bit. Here's where you can set up the destination profiles for that dispatcher. So console is just going to the console. I can change it to central logging, which I'll do in a sec, but you can see that I've specified a bunch. Here is the little editor if you want to build your own profile. You get all of the same details for where this is going to go. So this is a way to take the incoming request from somewhere else and tell it where it needs to go. It could, in theory, go to another dispatcher running on another machine. And you can just keep sending it around if you want it. You wouldn't do that, but you could. So let me close up those. Make sure that I'm setting this. Yeah, so I've got that content. So it's going to the console. My viewer is sitting here. And so now if I go ahead and run it after rebuilding, there we go. So my app is back. Here's my, now you can see that my destination now includes, I'm just writing out to the screen. So there's my network. I click the button, the log file gets updated because it's 341. And now I go over to the right here and hopefully it's there. And there's my messages that are actually coming from the Hero FMX from Coruscant, which is the name of that PC, not Condor, or not whichever one I call this one. This is Camino. So if I show the other messages, show the computer names, there's Camino and Coruscant. So this is really cool. I know a lot of people have been waiting to be able to do that. This is also neat when you have a mobile app. You know, it's connected to a host that you're working with for debugging, and you can see and get the CodeSite messages in the console from your mobile app. So, you guys like? Pretty interesting? I know it's late in the day. Everybody's waiting for that one more snack break. Okay, got a few more minutes. Let me get back to my slides here. And I talked about the custom data. Here's how we handle these assistant classes. So you could send the photo, the picture in individually, but there was a special dedicated method to do it. We now change that to use these assistants. So it's nearly the same, but we're just going to have somebody else package the data. And what's cool about it is that it leverages the same technique. I guess I skipped over these. This T-CodeSite message payload is what the helper, these assistant classes do for us. They package the data up into a CodeSite message payload, which then this new method here, send, takes that, and then we'll put it into the mix. Well, that's really quite cool because all you need to do is set up the CodeSite message payload with the right information in it, and it will get logged. So you could log whatever you want and still take full advantage. You no longer have to register a custom formatter or do anything like that. It's just built into the product, which is really cool. So some other improvements real quick. I mentioned the message format. There's performance improvements across the board. Everything's been optimized. We actually load faster. It will strategically load up into the viewer as messages come in, so it's not just one at a time with a full refresh. It will queue up like 10 at a time, so it then does them in batches faster. All of the tools are now 64-bit, so if you do run into some memory limitations like that 1.5 gigabyte log file I was telling you about, CodeSite doesn't like that, CodeSite 5, so you have to split it. We have tools that do that in CodeSite 5, but 64-bit has no problem with it. I mentioned that. We now support FireDAC support built into the database tools that we got, and I already talked about those. We can just keep this up. This is what I've been showing on. I mentioned that before. The obvious question is, when's it coming? When's it going to be released? We have not announced that yet. I haven't announced. We're still kind of cleaning up some of the rough edges, but we are very close to do that. If you are interested in doing this, learning how to use CodeSite, and you're not currently a CodeSite user, I highly recommend taking advantage of our discount here. So for all of the attendees, 25% off all of the products, including CodeSite. If you order CodeSite now, you will get CodeSite 6 for free. There will be no additional charge. I will say the price of CodeSite is going up for CodeSite 6. It has not changed since CodeSite 5 was released, and it's been that way for 9 years, 10 years. So it's been out for a long time. So we kind of need to bump that up a little bit, but you get to take advantage of it. Any questions on anything CodeSite related, Ray software related? I'm happy to answer.
Just a question, it's a technical question just to understand how it works. When you don't have, consider you don't have the dispatcher now, how do you cope with the lot of messages producing and slow connection, for example?
Yeah, so several things that are involved in that. Great questions. First is it's essentially the same, CodeSite 5, CodeSite 6, but I'll answer it in CodeSite 5 and tell you what's different. CodeSite 5, if the dispatcher isn't there, if it isn't present, then what the logger tries to do is we'll try to start it up. So there's an installer to install the dispatcher, basically creates a registry entry, so it's looking for that, and if it finds it, it says, oh, can I start it up? Great. If it doesn't exist or it can't start it up, then it will look in the local directory. Do I have a local version of the dispatcher running with my application? So some customers wanted to be able to, I want to deploy it, but I don't want to register it with the system. It's just in the same directory. It looks there. If it doesn't find it, or there's some other reason where it can't start it, the CodeSite logger disables itself. So it doesn't continue to try to do that with each CodeSite message. So if CodeSite can't be routed, then it just turns itself off and you don't see any impact. CodeSite 6 does essentially the same things, but the nuance is that there's an internal dispatcher now, so the dispatcher is always there, but it's possible that it can't actually route the message, dispatch it where it needs to. You've given a directory or a drive reference that doesn't exist, for example, or you're trying to connect remotely and there's no host there. It does essentially the same thing. It'll turn itself off, but it propagates it up through the system so that it doesn't turn off the dispatcher, it just turns off your logger. So you might have another logger that you've created which would do the same thing and it would turn off, but it could be using a different destination. So we got you covered to where we're not going to just constantly queue up a bunch of messages that can't be dispatched. And so they'll be foregone. We won't fill that up until they're there. Yes?
It's kind of a similar product like TestFairy. So the question here applies that suppose I want to use remote logging, but I don't really want to host my own server. Is there
Yes.
like a possibility to like buy some server already running on your side, or do I have to like spin my own server?
For now, we don't have anything set up to host other people's logging dispatch. We've kind of entertained the idea of doing that. I mean, if there was enough demand for that, what I'm actually kind of thinking about is, do we partner with Embarcadero and RAD server to produce a Docker image or something that also does the REST dispatching? Because it's just config. The routing of the message is straightforward. As long as you know how to recognize an incoming message and route it to some place that you would know about, there's no reason not to have that. We just don't have the infrastructure to support that for other companies, but we certainly are interested in getting your feedback if that's something you would like to see us take in the future. All right, thank you so much for attending. I really appreciate it.